The humid, oppressive air of New Harmony, Indiana, in the late summer of 1901, seemed to cling to everything. The cobblestone streets, the dense, whispering trees that bordered the town, and most importantly, the tightly drawn curtains of the houses. New Harmony was a place built on the promise of utopia and communal living, but in that stifling heat, it felt more like a forgotten relic, its idealism slowly suffocating under the weight of ordinary human flaws. Detective Elias Vance felt the weight of it all as he reviewed the missing person report on his desk. His office in the old town hall was small, stuffy, and smelled faintly of aged paper and pipe tobacco. Outside, the sky was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a storm that never seemed to break. The report concerned Clara Jenkins, a quiet 11-year-old girl who had been adopted 2 months prior by the Ellison family, who resided in the isolated grand estate known locally as the Preserve. The Ellisons, Dr. Alistair Ellison and his wife Serafina, were new to town, having moved from the East Coast. They were wealthy, aloof, and rarely seen, their presence marked only by the high, ornate fence that ringed their property. Dr. Ellison was rumored to be a retired physician involved in pioneering work, a vague term that did little to quell the townsfolk's inherent suspicion of outsiders, especially rich ones. Another one, Elias. Sergeant Miller, a man whose face was perpetually etched with small-town weariness, leaned against the doorframe. He didn't need to elaborate. Clara was the third adopted child in 2 years, all fostered by different families in the surrounding area, to vanish without a trace. But this was the first time one of the disappearances was directly linked to the Ellisons. Vance ran a calloused thumb over the photograph of Clara, a slight girl with dark, serious eyes and a tentative half-smile. She vanished from the Preserve's grounds late Friday night. The Ellisons claim she slipped out her window. No note, no forced entry, just gone. That estate is huge, Detective, and the Ellisons, they're strange, keep to themselves. You think they had anything to do with it? Miller's tone was more worried than accusatory. In a town where nothing ever happened, these disappearances were tearing the fragile social fabric apart. Vance sighed, pushing back his chair. The wood creaked loudly, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the silence of the late afternoon. Their story is too clean, Miller. Too ready. They waited nearly 24 hours to report her missing, claiming they thought she was just playing a game or hiding. People don't wait when a child goes missing, especially not a newly adopted one. The truth was, Vance had been watching the Ellisons. Not officially, but his intuition, honed by years of dealing with human darkness, had prickled ever since they arrived. Their adoption process had been unusually rapid, smoothed by their wealth and influence, overriding some of the standard background checks. The previous 2 missing children, he now realized, had been adopted through the same obscure, out-of-state agency that the Ellisons had used. It was a thread, thin and frayed, but a thread nonetheless. He grabbed his trench coat and hat. I'm heading out there now. I need to see the house, the window, and their faces when they tell the story again. Get a deputy to meet me there. And Miller, dig up everything you can on Dr. Alistair Ellison's medical practice. His pioneering work. See if it's medical innovation or something closer to quackery. The drive to the Preserve was a slow descent into deepening shadow. The road narrowed, the trees grew taller, and the air temperature seemed to drop several degrees. When he reached the iron gate, it stood open, like a silent black maw inviting him in. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity, all steep gables, dark wood, and excessive ornamentation. It wasn't beautiful. It was intimidating. The light pouring from the downstairs windows was a sickly yellow, casting long, nervous shadows across the overgrown lawn. Dr. Ellison, a tall, gaunt man with sharp eyes that seemed to constantly assess him, met Vance on the porch. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit, looking utterly composed, a stark contrast to the urgency of the situation. Detective Vance, thank you for coming. As I told your man on the phone, this is an unfortunate, distressing situation. His voice was low, measured, devoid of any genuine panic. "Dr. Ellison, I need to see Clara's room, and I need to ask you and your wife some questions." Vance didn't wait for permission. He stepped across the threshold. The house's interior was immaculate, almost sterile. The air inside was cool, dry, and carried a faint metallic scent that Vance couldn't quite place. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, or perhaps a laboratory. Clara's room was on the second floor. The window, which the Ellisons claimed was the exit point, faced a steep drop onto thick, muddy undergrowth. The latch was broken, which Dr. Ellison pointed out immediately. "She must have broken it when she forced it open," he stated. Vance knelt down. The dust on the windowsill was thick, yet there was a small, clean scrape mark, too precise to be made by a struggling child's hands. It looked like it was made by a tool. His eyes then tracked the floorboards. Just beneath the heavy, antique dresser, almost invisible in the dim light, was a faint dark smudge. It wasn't mud. It was the color of old, dried blood. "Dr. Ellison," Vance said, standing slowly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I don't think Clara ran away." The doctor's composure finally wavered. A flicker of something dark, not fear but annoyance, crossing his face before he locked it down again. "Detective, I assure you, you are mistaken. We loved that girl. She must have been troubled, perhaps ill. The challenges of adoption, you understand." Vance ignored him, his eyes now fixed on a small sealed door disguised as a built-in cabinet at the back of the room. It was too small to be a linen closet, and too out of place for a child's room. "What's behind that door, Doctor?" Ellison cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "That is merely a service area. Old ventilation shaft, nothing of interest." Vance walked toward it, his hand reaching for the ornate brass handle. He didn't believe the man. The metallic scent, the broken lock, the smudge. The pieces were beginning to align, not into a case of a runaway child, but into something far colder, far more calculating. As his fingers wrapped around the cold brass, a sudden loud thud echoed from the floorboards directly beneath them, the sound of something heavy falling in the room below. Dr. Ellison's eyes widened, a genuine panicked look replacing his controlled mask. He took a hasty step forward. "I told you, Detective, nothing of interest. Now I must insist you leave the premises." Vance ignored the command. His attention was wholly fixated on the brass handle, and the knowledge that whatever was hidden in this house, whatever secret the Ellison family was guarding, was directly connected to the quiet disappearance of little Clara Jenkins. The house had swallowed her, and the sound below was the first sign that whatever had consumed her was still very much alive, and actively trying to hide its presence. He twisted the handle and pulled, ready for whatever horror lay beyond. If you are enjoying this dive into psychological terror and suspense, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us uncover more chilling truths. The brass handle felt unnervingly cold beneath Detective Vance's fingers. When he pulled, the disguised cabinet door didn't swing open easily. It slid back into the wall with a quiet, oiled precision, revealing a tight, vertical space. Not a ventilation shaft, but a narrow, concealed staircase descending into absolute darkness. The metallic scent, faint upstairs, was here overpowering, a stench of rust, chemicals, and something vaguely organic like stale meat. Dr. Ellison's controlled panic escalated instantly. "Detective, I warned you, that area is unstable. It's part of the old heating system, strictly off limits." He reached out, his long fingers attempting to grab Vance's arm. Vance reacted swiftly, sidestepping the attempt. "Unstable, Doctor? Or a clear violation of a missing persons investigation?" He pulled his revolver, the click of the hammer echoing sharply in the silent house. It wasn't a threat, but a statement. The official rules had just changed. "Don't move, Doctor. Sergeant Miller is on his way, and you are currently obstructing an investigation." He didn't wait for Ellison's reply, which had devolved into a sputtering, desperate plea. Vance descended the rough-hewn wooden steps, the only light coming from the thin shaft spilling from Clara's room above. The steps ended in a short, musty corridor. He could now clearly hear the source of the earlier thud, a low, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging across a concrete floor, coming from the end of the hallway. The corridor opened into a vast, chilling space. This was not a basement for storage. It was a purpose-built underground facility. The air was cold, damp, and the metallic odor was now sickeningly strong. The walls were lined with heavy, bolted-down shelving, holding rows of unlabeled glass jars and bottles. In the center, under a single flickering gas lamp, was a large, bolted wooden crate lying on its side, the apparent source of the noise. As Vance approached cautiously, the scraping stopped. He raised his revolver, his eyes scanning the cavernous room. "Police! Show yourself!" Silence. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of condensation somewhere in the far corner. He cautiously circled the crate. It was enormous, the kind used for shipping large, heavy machinery. On the side, roughly stenciled, were the words, "Specimen Transport. Do not open." Suddenly a voice, high-pitched and choked with terror, whispered from behind the crate. "Please don't let them find me." Vance lowered his gun slightly. "Who are you? Are you Clara?" "No, my name is Thomas. They locked me down here. They're coming back." Thomas, another child, one of the other missing children from the previous years. Vance signaled to the unseen boy. "I'm Detective Vance. I'm here to help. Where are the Ellisons keeping you?" The boy's voice was barely audible. They keep us in the small rooms, in the back." The small rooms were revealed when Vance moved past the crate, a series of 6 heavy, steel-reinforced doors set into the far wall. They looked less like bedrooms and more like isolation chambers. He ran toward them, heart pounding, adrenaline surging past the professional caution he usually maintained. Just as he reached the first door, a sound from the main house pierced the silence of the basement. The rhythmic squeak of the basement door hinges opening. The Ellisons were coming. Vance quickly yanked Thomas, a thin, pale boy of perhaps 9, from behind the crate. "We have to go. Now." "But the others," Thomas wailed, pointing a trembling finger at the steel doors. "Clara is in there. I heard her crying a little while ago." Vance hesitated, a terrible calculation flashing through his mind. He was alone, armed only with a revolver, facing 2 unknown, desperate individuals who had clearly engineered a horrifying scenario. He couldn't storm the cells and protect Thomas simultaneously. His immediate priority had to be securing the witness and getting help. "We will come back for them, I promise you," he assured the boy, pulling him towards the concealed staircase. He pushed Thomas up the stairs. The moment the boy disappeared into the dark opening, the heavy footsteps of Dr. Ellison and a second person, presumably Serafina, the wife, echoed in the passage. Vance drew his gun, positioning himself in the shadowed corner behind the crate, using the vast piece of shipping equipment as a shield. The 2 figures emerged into the gaslight. Serafina was as composed as her husband, a woman with a chillingly placid face, holding something long and thin, a metal rod or cane. "Where is he, Alistair? Where is the little coward?" Serafina's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to her husband's nervous energy. "He was just here, my dear. The detective found the stairs. He must have released the boy. The detective. He's still down here." Ellison sounded furious, the mask of the sophisticated physician completely gone, replaced by the raw panic of a criminal caught red-handed. "Detective Vance," Serafina called out, her voice dangerously calm. "You have trespassed and taken stolen property. Return the boy, and we can perhaps discuss terms." Vance knew there would be no discussion. He needed to create a distraction. He fired a single shot from his revolver, not at them, but into the large, heavy electrical junction box humming softly on the opposite wall. The ensuing shower of sparks and the immediate plunge into darkness was absolute. The gas lamp flickered once and died. The metallic scent intensified, and the silence was replaced by the chaotic sounds of the Ellisons scrambling, cursing, and the heavy thud of the metal rod hitting the concrete floor. Vance used the darkness. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut and sliding the bolt home, a small, momentary victory. He found Thomas huddled in the corner of Clara's room. "Come on, we're running." They dashed down the main hall and down the grand staircase. Vance could hear the enraged shouting of Dr. Ellison echoing from below the floorboards. As they reached the main front door, they encountered Sergeant Miller, who had just arrived, his face confused by the darkness and the distant sounds of shouting. "Elias, what the devil?" "No time, Miller. The Ellisons are holding children. This boy is Thomas, one of the missing. They have Clara and others in the basement. Get him to safety and call the marshal. Tell them I need a full assault team here and an ambulance. I'm going back in." Miller, seeing the pale, shaking boy and the wild look in Vance's eyes, didn't argue. He took Thomas's hand. Vance pushed the door shut behind them, hearing the first frantic sounds of the Ellisons breaking through the locked cabinet door. He turned, facing the grand, terrifying facade of the preserve, and drew a deep, steadying breath. He knew his hasty retreat had saved Thomas, but his professional obligation and a new, consuming fury demanded he return for the children trapped in those steel cells. The truth of the Macabre Ellison family was about to be forcibly unearthed. The moment the front door slammed shut, Detective Vance felt the shift from a chaotic investigation to a tactical siege. He was alone, isolated in the entry hall of a monster's house, and the monsters were enraged. He could hear Dr. Ellison's voice, a high-pitched manic roar from the hallway above. "They're still here. The boy is gone, but the detective must be covering his tracks. Find him, Serafina. Don't let him leave the grounds." Vance slipped into the deep shadow of the hall closet, thankful for the dim, fading light filtering through the tall, narrow windows. He knew the house was their territory. Every shadow, every creak was familiar to them. He had to assume they had ways to secure the main exits. The main challenge was not leaving, but getting back to the basement. The hidden stairwell in Clara's room was sealed, and the Ellisons were undoubtedly on the second floor, searching. He needed an alternate route. He moved silently through the main floor, his feet finding the thick Persian rugs. He found the pantry, a large room leading to the kitchen. The faint metallic odor from the basement was strongest here, and he noticed a small old-fashioned dumbwaiter shaft built into the wall, used traditionally to transport food between floors. The wooden door to the shaft was slightly ajar. This was a risk, but his only viable path. He tested the mechanism. The rope was old and frayed, but the wooden box was sturdy enough to hold his weight. He squeezed inside, pulling the door shut just as he heard the rapid footfalls of Serafina Ellison entering the main hall. Vance pulled the rope, the gears grinding and groaning in protest. The descent was slow, agonizingly loud in the tense silence. He could hear Serafina's voice now, right outside the pantry door, her tone deadly quiet. "He's not upstairs, Alistair. He's a professional. He'll look for another way down. The service shafts. Check the service shafts." Vance froze the dumbwaiter box. Stopping just above the basement-level opening, he could see a sliver of light from below. He needed to be silent. Below him, he heard Dr. Ellison's sharp voice. "Serafina." The detective broke the lock on the concealed door. "We need to move the remaining subjects now. They cannot be compromised." "The protocols, Alistair. We follow the protocols," Serafina replied, her voice unnervingly calm, even in panic. "Initiate phase gamma. The room is soundproofed. No one heard the shot. We have time." Phase gamma. The clinical term sent a new wave of horror through Vance. This wasn't just imprisonment. It was a planned, structured operation. Vance realized he couldn't wait. He used the butt of his revolver to gently force open the dumbwaiter's basement hatch. He slipped out, landing silently on the stone floor of a small, musty storage room adjacent to the main underground laboratory. The lab was now partially lit by a dim, portable kerosene lamp that Dr. Ellison had retrieved. Ellison was standing by the row of steel doors, frantically working a heavy brass lock on one of them. Serafina stood guard near the staircase opening. Vance saw his opportunity. He crept along the wall, using the tall stacks of wooden crates and scientific equipment as cover. He was aiming for the steel doors, hoping to reach them before Ellison could implement whatever phase gamma entailed. As he moved, he saw the contents of the room more clearly. The jars on the shelves were not holding chemicals. Many contained preserved organs, labeled with numbers and dates. Near the center, a large antique operating table stood, its surface gleaming under the kerosene lamp, stained with deep, oxidized patches. This was not a retired doctor's passion project. This was a place of systematic, premeditated abuse and experimentation. He was a mere 10 feet from the steel doors when Serafina's eyes, sharp and predatory, locked onto his position. "Alistair, behind the centrifuge," she yelled, raising her thin metal rod. It wasn't a cane. It was a long, solid steel bar, perhaps a piece of lab equipment, and she held it with surprising strength. Ellison immediately spun around, pulling something from his suit jacket, a small, wickedly sharp scalpel. Vance had to act fast. He fired 2 shots, one at the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into darkness once more, and one at the floor near Serafina, sending a spray of concrete shards that momentarily stunned her. In the ensuing chaos, he charged the steel doors. He found the door that Ellison had been fumbling with, labeled simply 3, and kicked it with all his strength. The old lock, already stressed by Ellison's tampering, gave way with a screech of tortured metal. He flung the door open. Inside, a little girl, huddled in the corner, her face pale and streaked with tears, looked up at him. It was Clara Jenkins. "Clara, we have to go." Vance grabbed her small hand, but before he could pull her out, Serafina was upon him. She lunged, not with a metal bar, but with a surprising savage strength, driving a sharp elbow into his ribs. The pain was blinding. Vance staggered, momentarily releasing Clara's hand. "You won't ruin my husband's work," Serafina hissed, her face inches from his, distorted by a terrifying, fanatic rage. Dr. Ellison, recovering from the dark, lunged with the scalpel. Vance ducked, the cold steel whistling past his ear. This wasn't a fight with ordinary criminals. The Ellisons were desperate, fanatical, and clearly willing to die or kill to protect their work. Vance shoved Serafina off with a desperate push, retrieved his gun, and shielded Clara, who was now screaming, a raw sound of terror that finally broke through the silence of the sealed room. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Stay back! I have a witness! The police are here!" "A witness who will tell them nothing," Ellison snarled, advancing. "We've taken care of that." The mention of taking care of that chilled Vance to the core. He knew he couldn't fight them both. He saw a small, heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the door. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he pulled Clara out of the cell, shoved her behind the operating table, and grabbed the extinguisher. He didn't spray the foam. He swung the heavy metal canister like a club, catching Dr. Ellison squarely on the side of the head. The doctor dropped instantly, the scalpel clattering across the floor. Serafina let out a guttural cry of pure vengeance and charged, swinging her metal bar. Vance managed to duck, but the bar scraped his shoulder. He retaliated with a hard kick to her leg. She staggered, but did not fall. The fanaticism was her shield. Vance knew he was at his limit. He grabbed Clara's hand. "Run! Through the dumbwaiter, go!" Clara, terrified but obedient, scrambled toward the small shaft. Vance kept his gun trained on the still-standing Serafina. He needed a clear path of retreat. He noticed a small, unmarked vial that had been knocked over in the scuffle on the operating table, and the sickly metallic odor was strongest from the vial's spilled contents. He pointed his gun at the woman's chest. "I'm calling the marshal. You're done." But before he could move, Serafina let out a chilling, empty laugh. "You're too late, detective. The work is almost complete." She turned, not to attack, but to the cell next to Clara's, door number 4. She reached into her pocket, pulled a small silver key, and opened the door. Vance watched, horrified, as a figure, not a child but a hunchbacked, misshapen adult figure, barely recognizable as human, emerged slowly from the cell, its eyes wide and vacant, its skin mottled and scarred. It moved with an unnatural, halting gait. "Meet the result of our pioneering work, Detective," Serafina whispered, her voice full of pride. "The perfect, obedient subject. And it protects its family." The creature stared at Vance, and with a low, inhuman growl, it started to move toward him, blocking the only path to the dumbwaiter shaft and Clara's escape. The psychological terror of the Ellison family's true experiments had just taken a monstrously physical form. Vance was trapped. The creature lumbered forward, its shadow grotesquely enlarged by the flickering light filtering from the small gap in the dumbwaiter hatch. It was clear that the Ellisons' experiments were not merely about isolation or deprivation, but about profound physical and mental distortion. The thing moving toward Detective Vance was the living, breathing, tragic result of years of horrific procedures, a silent testament to the family's macabre and utterly unethical medical pursuits. "Stay still, Detective," Serafina commanded, her voice now a triumphant purr. She was no longer focused on physical confrontation, but on observing the creature's reaction. "It doesn't recognize fear, only threat. And you are a significant threat to the sanctity of our home." Vance had to use all his training to fight the visceral instinct to simply shoot the monstrous figure. He knew this creature was not a monster, but another victim, likely one of the other missing adopted children, warped beyond recognition. Firing his gun might put Clara, who was still trying to climb into the dumbwaiter, at risk, and certainly wouldn't help the others trapped in the steel cells. He kept his gun aimed, but did not pull the trigger. He needed to incapacitate the Ellisons, not destroy their victim. "What have you done to that person?" Vance demanded, his voice ringing with a deep, furious sorrow. Dr. Ellison, who was groaning and stirring on the floor, managed to raise his head. "We achieved purity of instruction, Detective. Total obedience. The mind, stripped of its complicating emotional components, is a blank slate. It is perfect." He coughed, a thin trail of blood tracing his jawline. Vance saw his chance. While Serafina was focused on her subject, he grabbed the fire extinguisher again and hurled it with force across the room toward the unconscious body of Dr. Ellison, hoping the noise and clatter would draw the creature's attention. It worked. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Its attention diverted, Vance pushed past it, ignoring the brush of its coarse institutional clothing, and raced toward the dumbwaiter shaft. "Clara, hurry!" Clara, her eyes wide with unutterable terror, finally squeezed into the narrow box. Vance grabbed the rope, preparing to pull her upward, when Serafina lunged again, not at Vance, but at the rope. She seized the rope with both hands, jerking it down with surprising force. Clara cried out as the box dropped a few inches with a sickening thunk. "You're not taking the evidence," Serafina shrieked. "You will not expose us." Vance was locked in a brutal tug-of-war for the fate of the child. He pulled back, his own adrenaline-fueled strength pitting against her desperate, crazed power. The heavy wooden box carrying Clara creaked ominously. He needed leverage. He looked down and saw Dr. Ellison stirring again, reaching blindly for his fallen scalpel. The creature was slowly advancing again, closer now. Vance had to make a choice. He released the rope, allowing Serafina a moment of false victory, and darted back toward the cells. "You want to protect your experiments, Serafina? Let's see you protect them all." He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar he saw leaning against the wall, likely used by the Ellisons to secure the doors, and used it to smash the locks on the remaining cells, doors 5 and 6. The noise was deafening. He didn't know what was inside, or if the children were even alive. But he needed a diversion. He flung open the last 2 doors. 2 more figures, one a gaunt teenage boy and the other a younger, frail girl, stumbled out into the dim light. They were clearly malnourished and confused, but they were human. They blinked at the light, their faces etched with the confusion of long-term confinement. The release of 3 victims at once, Clara in the shaft, Thomas outside, and now these 2, shattered Serafina's focus. She had to choose between the rope, the approaching creature, and the newly freed subjects. Her eyes darted wildly, the perfect composed mask finally broken. "The subjects! Alistair, the subjects are compromised," she screamed. Dr. Ellison, still dazed, rose to his knees and saw the chaos. His priority was clear: control. He staggered toward the two newly released children, his remaining hand outstretched, intending to physically drag them back. This gave Vance the moment he needed. He raced back to the rope, pulling with desperate, raw strength. Clara's box began to ascend, the pulley screaming in protest. "Keep pulling, Clara! Don't stop!" he shouted up the shaft. He turned to face the advancing creature. It was now almost upon him. Vance braced himself, knowing a bullet would likely only enrage it further. "It will stop if it sees its master hurt," he realized suddenly. He threw the heavy iron bar with all his strength at Dr. Ellison, aiming for his legs. The bar struck Ellison's knee with a sickening crack, and the doctor went down in a scream of pain that finally transcended his professional demeanor. The creature, the perfect subject, immediately stopped its slow, relentless advance. It turned its vacant gaze toward its injured master, a flicker of confusion, or perhaps distress, crossing its face. This unexpected reaction, the creature prioritizing the man who had created its misery, was the key to the Ellisons' grotesque control. Vance seized the lull. He grabbed the teenager and the little girl. "Follow me. We have to go now." They scrambled toward the dumbwaiter shaft. Clara's voice called down, weak but determined. "Detective Vance, I'm at the top. Go to the office. Find Sergeant Miller. Tell him to wait at the main gate." Vance looked back. Serafina, her face a mask of utter fury, was kneeling beside her husband, shielding him. The creature stood over them, its posture defensive. The entire scene was a perverse family portrait, a horrific tableau of devotion to evil. Vance realized that he had achieved his objective, the rescue of the surviving children. He grabbed the teenager and the girl and pushed them into the dumbwaiter space. He was the last one in, the space impossibly cramped, the metallic scent overwhelming. He began pulling the rope, knowing that Serafina would come after them, driven by a fury that was now mixed with cold calculation. The rope was straining, the wood groaning. As he was hoisted upward, he saw Serafina look up at the opening, her face partially obscured by shadow, but her eyes burning with an intense, deadly promise. She didn't shout. She simply reached out and grabbed the metal bar her husband had dropped, her composure terrifyingly restored. Vance knew this was far from over. He had the victims, but the perpetrators and their secrets were still locked within the preserve, and he knew they would pursue their stolen subjects with relentless, methodical zeal. The ascent in the dumbwaiter was slow, painful, and terrifyingly noisy. The pulleys screamed in protest under the weight of Vance and the two children, the teenager, who seemed to be named Silas, and the younger girl, Eliza. They finally emerged into the dark pantry. The front of the house was silent, but Vance could hear the distinct sound of movement from the basement stairs, the heavy, purposeful footsteps of Serafina Ellison. Go through the front door. Run to the main road. Don't stop," Vance commanded the two children. They were too dazed to argue, their long confinement having stripped them of the will to disobey. He held the pantry door closed, bracing his foot against it. He heard Serafina burst into the kitchen, her breath ragged. She didn't come to the door immediately. Instead, Vance heard the distinct click of a heavy lock engaging the outer kitchen entrance. The Ellisons were methodically sealing their house to trap him. He knew he couldn't stay. He burst out of the pantry, not towards the front door, but towards a rarely used side entrance near the greenhouse, hoping it would be less secured. He found Silas and Eliza waiting near the front door, paralyzed by fear and confusion. "I said run!" Vance shoved them outside, ignoring the metallic sting of the heavy rain that had finally begun to fall, turning the manicured lawn into a slick, muddy obstacle course. The three of them sprinted down the long, winding drive toward the front gate. The rain was a blessing, obscuring their tracks and muffling the sounds of their escape. As they neared the massive iron gates, Vance saw two shapes moving near the road. Sergeant Miller and an unfamiliar man, likely the deputy, and with them, little Clara and Thomas, huddled under a small umbrella. "Miller, get them out of here. Take the carriage to the marshal's office. Do not stop. They are armed and dangerous," Vance shouted over the downpour. Miller, seeing the gaunt, terrified faces of the two new children, didn't hesitate. He bundled the 4 children into the waiting carriage. Vance watched them pull away, then turned back to the looming gates. He had to delay the Ellisons, or they would track the children down immediately. He found a large, heavy chain used to secure the gates overnight and used it to lash the iron gates shut. The heavy padlock was missing, but the chain was thick and cumbersome enough to buy them precious minutes. As he secured the last link, he heard a tremendous crash from inside the house, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The Ellisons had realized their prisoners were gone and were taking a more aggressive route. Vance ran into the cover of the dense woods bordering the preserve. He had to move fast, circling around to a position where he could observe the house and wait for the marshal's men. Hours passed. The rain continued, soaking him to the bone. The air grew cold. He watched the massive house, silent and dark, except for the single sickly yellow light that remained on the first floor. It was a cold, ominous watch. Finally, just before dawn, he saw the faint lights of carriages and horses approaching the main road, the marshal and his team. Vance emerged from the woods, a figure of exhaustion and soaked wool. He directed the marshal, a hard-nosed veteran named Garrison, and his deputies to the hidden stairs in Clara's room. The raid was swift, methodical, and chillingly quiet. Vance was later in the small, sterile room at the New Harmony marshal's office, watching Thomas, Silas, Eliza, and Clara being attended to by a doctor. They were physically frail and psychologically shattered, but alive. Sergeant Miller entered, his face grim. "We got them, Elias. They were holed up in the basement, destroying evidence. Dr. Ellison resisted. We found this." Miller placed a heavy, leather-bound journal on the table. It was Dr. Ellison's handwriting. "And the creature?" Vance asked, his voice low. "Secured in a separate unit. The doctor called it Subject Alpha. It didn't fight. It just stood there looking at Ellison like a lost dog." The interrogation room was cold. Dr. Alistair Ellison sat across from Vance, his leg in a makeshift splint, his eyes dark with defiant contempt. Serafina was in an adjacent room, refusing to speak. "Your pioneering work, Doctor," Vance started, pushing the leather journal across the table. "You were experimenting on children. Adopted children, specifically those with malleable family histories. Why?" Ellison leaned forward, his voice a low, intense whisper, betraying no remorse, only fanaticism. "You don't understand, Detective. I was attempting to achieve the perfect therapeutic bonding, to remove the psychological scars of their birth families. It was an accelerated adoption method, a kind of surgical, chemical, and psychological reformation." "Reformation? You surgically altered them, Doctor. You starved them. You broke their minds and bodies. Subject Alpha, the creature, what was his name?" "Irrelevant," Ellison sneered. "He was the first true success. He shed his past identity entirely. He exists only for the benefit and protection of his new family. The others, Clara, Thomas, they were merely recalcitrant subjects. They held on to their past attachments. That's where the complication lay." Vance spent 2 hours pressing him, not for a confession. They had enough evidence for a dozen, but for the motive behind the sheer, meticulous evil. Ellison finally revealed the deepest, darkest secret. "We weren't merely testing adoption methods, Detective. We needed a solution. My late wife and I lost our only son years ago. He was uncontrollable, vicious, unsalvageable. I theorized that the fault was not in the environment, but in the base material, the original family bond. We sought to create the perfect, emotionally blank, obedient child. We used the adoption agency to find the specific profiles, children who were already considered difficult or unwanted, to prove that my methods could create pure, loyal devotion where nature had failed." The chilling reality hit Vance. The Ellisons weren't just mad scientists. They were grieving, narcissistic parents who had used dozens of vulnerable children as raw material for a desperate, perverted attempt to replace their failed child with a perfect, obedient model. Suddenly, a loud, panicked commotion erupted from the outer office, yelling, the sound of glass breaking, and a heavy, familiar growl. "It's Subject Alpha!" a deputy screamed. "It broke through the wall. It's looking for the doctor." Vance sprang from his seat, realizing the chilling, terrible efficiency of the Ellisons' perfect therapeutic bonding. They had indeed created a fiercely devoted protector, and now, with its master captured, the creature was following its final lethal protocol: eliminate the threat and secure the family. The door to the interrogation room burst open, and the misshapen figure of Subject Alpha stood in the frame, its vacant eyes fixed on Detective Vance, the man who had injured its creator. The creature, Subject Alpha, stood framed in the broken doorway of the interrogation room, a tangible embodiment of the horrors described in Dr. Ellison's journal. It was physically imposing, clearly stronger than an average man, a horrifying synthesis of trauma and warped scientific manipulation. Dr. Ellison, despite his fear of the law, felt a perverse pride. "You see, Detective? Perfection. Complete devotion. He knows you are the aggressor." Vance ignored the doctor. He knew this was a psychological trap. Shooting the creature would not solve anything. It would only be a tragedy compounding another. He had to use its twisted devotion against the Ellisons. "Alpha," Vance said slowly, clearly, keeping his voice steady and non-threatening. "The man who hurt you, the man who starved you, is the one who adopted you. He is the one who changed you." The creature tilted its head, its vacant eyes displaying only confusion. Its training had been absolute. The Ellisons were family. The police were the threat. Just then, Serafina Ellison, having overpowered a deputy, rushed into the room. She was holding a chair leg, her face a mask of fanatical purpose. "Alpha, protect your father," she commanded, her voice ringing with maternal authority. The creature instantly responded to the voice of its mother. It shifted its weight, adopting a protective stance in front of Dr. Ellison. Vance seized the moment. "Serafina, tell me the truth about the first child, the one who disappeared before Thomas, the one you failed to bond with." Serafina hesitated, a flicker of genuine distress replacing her fanaticism. It was the only crack in her armor. He was a failure," she whispered, her eyes dark with a mixture of shame and fury. "He kept trying to escape. He wouldn't forget his real mother." Ellison glared at his wife. "Serafina, you will not confess to this imbecile." "Shut up, Alistair," she hissed, an unprecedented level of real conflict erupting between the two. Vance pressed his advantage, stepping back toward the door to put distance between himself and the creature. "Where is he, Serafina? Where did you dispose of the first failure?" "We didn't dispose of him," Ellison shouted, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. "He simply returned to nature, a complication of the procedure. He became feral, untraceable." Vance didn't believe the vague clinical lie. He saw the cold, deep fear in Serafina's eyes. He knew the Ellisons were meticulous. They would never leave a body to be found. Suddenly, the door to the holding cell area swung open, and Sergeant Miller rushed in, followed by 2 armed deputies. They saw the scene: Vance, the 2 crazed Ellisons, and the hulking, misshapen creature. "Drop your weapon, Serafina. Alpha, stand down," Miller commanded. The creature's programming was now conflicted. It had been told the police were a threat, but the new authoritative voice was not the detective's. It stood frozen, looking from Serafina to the uniformed deputies. Serafina saw the net closing. Her eyes darted to the window, then to the creature, and then to her husband. She made a final, desperate calculation. She screamed at the top of her lungs, a raw, piercing sound. "They're going to hurt your father, Alpha. Protect him." The command was absolute. The creature launched itself toward the deputies, not with calculated violence, but with a wild, desperate energy, a tragically loyal shield. chaos erupted. The deputies reacted instantly, not with guns, but with heavy iron restraints they had brought specifically for the creature. The struggle was brutal, silent, and concentrated in a corner of the room. Vance used the distraction to approach Serafina. He grabbed her arm, his grip iron-hard. The basement. There's another room. Where are the bodies of the children who didn't succeed? Serafina spat on the floor. There are no bodies, detective, only biological waste. Resources that could not be repurposed. Vance's heart sank at the cold clinicality of the term. He knew what biological waste meant in the context of Dr. Ellison's experimental lab, incineration or chemical dissolution. He looked at Dr. Ellison, who was watching the struggle, a thin, satisfied smile returning to his face. The work is immortal, detective. Even if you hold us here, the principles have been proven. Perfect loyalty can be created. Vance realized that to truly break them, he had to prove the principle was flawed. He stepped back and yelled directly at the creature, which was still struggling against the restraints. Alpha, look at the children outside. Clara, Thomas, they are scared. Your father is the reason they are scared, not the police. The creature suddenly stopped struggling. Its head swiveled toward the hallway where Clara and the other children were being held. The high-pitched, thin sound of a child's sob, likely Clara's, cut through the noise of the struggle. The perfect subject reacted to the genuine, unadulterated distress of a fellow victim. The programming held, but the underlying human empathy, which Ellison claimed to have removed, was a powerful, unexpected variable. The creature went utterly still. The deputies quickly secured it, strapping its massive frame into a heavy gurney. Serafina watched the creature being secured, the finality of the loss crushing her. Her defiance finally broke. She didn't look at Vance. She stared at the gurney being wheeled away. "The greenhouse, detective," she whispered, her voice dead. "The subterranean cistern. It's where we disposed of the waste. The first boy. He wasn't waste. He found his way out of the cellar and was hiding on the grounds for days. He was feral, but his eyes, they were still his." She confessed to the ultimate horror, not out of remorse, but because the sight of their perfect creation being taken away had destroyed the one thing they truly valued, their insane legacy. The mystery of the Ellisons was resolved, not by police work alone, but by the unexpected, raw power of shared human trauma. Vance felt a wave of nausea, but also profound relief. The case was closed. But the true investigation, the one into the lingering psychological damage, was just beginning. The sun finally rose over New Harmony, a pale, indifferent light illuminating the devastation left in the wake of the Ellisons' arrest. The marshal's office was a scene of controlled chaos, now transitioning from a tactical operation to a detailed forensic investigation. Dr. Alistair Ellison and Serafina Ellison were heavily guarded, their immediate fate sealed. The search of the subterranean cistern, guided by Serafina's broken confession, tragically confirmed the extent of their depravity, locating the remnants of several unidentifiable individuals, the biological waste that could not be repurposed. The mystery was over, replaced by a grim, undeniable truth. Detective Vance, exhausted and emotionally drained, sat with Sergeant Miller, reviewing the medical reports on the survivors. "They're alive, Elias. That's a miracle," Miller said, taking a slow sip of lukewarm coffee. "But the doctors are worried about long-term effects. Malnutrition, psychological trauma. Silas and Eliza, the last two you found, they barely speak. What about Thomas? And Clara?" Vance asked, his focus entirely on the children. "Clara Jenkins," Miller read from the report. "She's showing signs of hypervigilance, jumps at every sound, but she's clinging to Thomas. They're finding strength in each other. They're talking about the basement, about the forced lessons, the things Ellison called re-education therapies." Vance rubbed his eyes. The interrogation, the cellar, the horrifying sight of Subject Alpha, it all felt like a nightmare he hadn't yet woken from. And Subject Alpha, secured at the state asylum, under heavy guard. They've named him Daniel, the name on the adoption papers. The doctors are baffled. They say his physical deformities are severe, but the mental conditioning is the real terror. He responds to the sound of Ellison's voice on a recording more than his actual name. They're calling it induced loyalty syndrome. Vance knew the creature's existence would haunt him forever, a living, breathing testament to the dark possibilities of human cruelty and the corruption of science. The only positive note was the inherent, unexpected human empathy Daniel had shown when he heard Clara's genuine distress, momentarily overriding his programming. It proved that the perfection Ellison claimed to have achieved was a fundamental lie. Later that afternoon, Vance was permitted a brief, controlled meeting with the children's temporary guardian, a social worker named Eleanor Hayes, a strong, empathetic woman who had been crucial in coordinating the care for Thomas and Clara before the Ellisons' arrest. Eleanor brought Clara and Thomas to the meeting room. Clara was silent, holding Thomas's hand tightly. Thomas, though still pale, looked at Vance with a measure of relief and respect. "Detective Vance," Thomas said, his voice stronger than before. "Is it really over? Will they ever hurt another boy or girl?" "It's over, Thomas," Vance assured him, meeting the boy's solemn gaze. "The Ellisons will never leave custody. They are charged with kidnapping, torture, and multiple counts of murder." Clara finally spoke, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "The things in the jars, in the basement, were those us?" Vance knelt, bringing himself to their level, his heart aching. "No, Clara. Those were terrible things that belonged to the Ellisons, not to you. You are whole. You survived, and you saved your friends. You helped me save Silas and Eliza. You are the strongest person I've ever met." Eleanor took over, explaining the next steps. Psychological counseling, physical rehabilitation, and the long, slow journey toward finding safe, loving families, or being reunited with their original families if possible. The children, broken but not entirely shattered, were on a long road to recovery, and the support of each other was clearly the anchor. Vance watched them leave, the weight of the case finally lifting, replaced by the profound, quiet exhaustion of dealing with pure human evil. He had his confession, his evidence, and the survivors. The Ellisons were broken, and their legacy, the horror of Subject Alpha, was secured. He picked up a copy of Dr. Ellison's journal, its leather cover worn, and its pages filled with meticulous, chilling detail. He knew the details of the experiments would be crucial in the upcoming trials. He stood up, walking toward the window. The rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner, sharper. Sergeant Miller approached him, holding a small silver locket. "We found this under a floorboard in Clara's cell. It has a picture of a woman inside. Her mother, we think." Vance took the locket. It was a tangible link to the outside world, a tiny piece of the past attachment that Ellison had failed so brutally to erase. It was the proof that the human spirit, even in the darkest isolation, retains its core. "Give this to Eleanor," Vance instructed. "It's hers. And tell her to make sure the children know they didn't escape alone. They used their wits. They used their support for each other. That's what saved them." He looked out at the street, knowing the world of New Harmony was forever changed. The utopia was gone, replaced by the reality of human darkness, yet also by the resilience of the young lives that survived it. The psychological war was won, but the healing had only just begun. Thank you for staying with this harrowing story. If you're gripped by the mystery and the resilience of these survivors, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We'll be diving deeper into the unsettling revelations of the Ellison trial in the next chapter. The trial of Dr. Alistair Ellison and Serafina Ellison became an immediate national sensation. In the early 1900s, a case involving the systematic torture, kidnapping, and murder of adopted children by a wealthy, educated couple was unheard of. It dominated the headlines, pushing stories of politics and war to the side. The phrase "the macabre preserve" became a grim nickname for the Ellisons' former home. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, built on 3 key pieces of evidence: 1. Detective Vance's testimony and the physical evidence from the subterranean lab. 2. Dr. Ellison's detailed journals, which catalogued the psychological, chemical, and surgical reformations of the subjects. 3. The testimony of the survivors: Clara Jenkins, Thomas, Silas, and Eliza. The children's accounts were the most devastating. They spoke of the Ellisons' meticulous cruelty, the forced starvation, the hours of sensory deprivation, the injections of unknown substances, and the lessons designed to destroy their memories of their birth families and instill absolute, blind loyalty to the Ellisons. Clara, bolstered by the presence of Thomas, spoke about the metallic smell and the single, sickly yellow light in the basement. Silas, the teenager, managed to articulate the constant psychological manipulation, how the Ellisons would switch roles, one offering kindness and the other immediate sharp punishment, creating a classic trauma bond. The defense, led by a high-profile attorney from Chicago, attempted to paint the Ellisons as victims of their own misguided genius. The defense argued for a plea of insanity, claiming that the grief over their dead son had driven them to a medically revolutionary, albeit ethically questionable, attempt at creating the perfect family. Vance, however, systematically dismantled this defense during his cross-examination. He focused on the Ellisons' meticulous planning, the use of an out-of-state adoption agency, the rapid sale of their previous property, the construction of the secret basement facility, and the detailed, logical planning of Phase Gamma for evidence destruction. Dr. Ellison's actions were not random acts of a grieving madman, Vance stated to the jury, his voice clear and firm. They were the cold, calculated steps of a man committed to a monstrous ideology. Grief is not an excuse for methodical torture. His journals demonstrate logical, scientific progression, not mental aberration. The presence of Daniel, subject alpha, was the most controversial aspect. The prosecution argued that Daniel was not a creature, but a deeply damaged human victim of severe abuse, and his existence proved the severity of the Ellisons' crimes. The defense, however, used Daniel as Exhibit A for the insane genius argument, claiming his condition proved a scientific, if unsuccessful, attempt at a breakthrough, not malicious intent. During the third week of the trial, Serafina Ellison, silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally broke. She interrupted the testimony of the state psychiatrist, standing up in court. "We did it for our son," she screamed, her voice cracking the courtroom's tense silence. "He needed a brother. A devoted brother. The world gives you nothing. You have to engineer your own happiness." Her outburst was a gift to the prosecution. It wasn't the plea of a woman broken by grief, but the furious, arrogant demand of a woman who believed she had the right to manufacture human life for her own selfish desires. The jury, composed mostly of townsfolk from New Harmony and the surrounding conservative area, listened with grim focus. They had seen the wreckage of their small, peaceful community, the tarnished reputation, the fear, the realization that such evil could live in their midst. The evidence was not just legal, it was deeply personal. The final days of the trial were dominated by the closing arguments. The prosecutor painted a picture of absolute, unadulterated evil, asking the jury to look into the survivors' eyes and see the cost of the Ellisons' hubris. Vance, watching the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, felt the deep, profound satisfaction of seeing justice slowly, inevitably grind forward. But he knew the conviction wouldn't be the end. The children were safe, the monsters caged, but the scars were permanent. On the final day, the courtroom was packed. Every eye was on the jury as they filed back in. The foreman stood, and the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, battery, and multiple counts of first-degree murder for the victims whose remains were found in the cistern. The reaction was immediate. A wave of relieved, guttural murmurs swept through the courtroom. Outside, the waiting crowd of townspeople erupted in a roar of satisfaction and sorrow. Dr. Ellison received the news with a detached clinical nod, his composure returning instantly. Serafina simply stared at the floor, a single tear tracing a path through the makeup on her cheek. Their fate was sealed. Life imprisonment. Vance felt a deep, exhausted closure. He had been the one to find the key, to descend into the darkness, and to drag the truth into the light. The horror of the Macabre Ellison family was officially over. As he walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun casting long orange shadows, he saw Sergeant Miller talking quietly with Eleanor Hayes and the 4 children, Clara, Thomas, Silas, and Eliza. They were holding hands. They were survivors. And their ordeal, while a tragedy, had forced the community to face the uncomfortable truth. Evil often wears a respectable mask. Vance approached the group. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent guardian, a symbol of the justice that had been won. Eleanor smiled at him, a tired, genuine smile. "They're going home now, Detective. To a safe place. Together." The image of the 4 children, walking away hand in hand toward a secure future, was the only true victory in the entire case. The psychological terror had been replaced by a quiet, determined hope. Weeks after the Ellisons' conviction, Detective Vance found himself still anchored to the case. Though legally closed, the horror had left too many unseen scars on the town and on the children. He spent his time coordinating with Eleanor Hayes, ensuring the long-term safety and psychological care of the survivors. The focus of his investigation shifted from the Ellisons' crimes to their network of collaborators. How had they procured so many children? Vance and Miller discovered that the out-of-state adoption agency the Ellisons used, called the Paternal Heritage, was a front. It wasn't large, but it was incredibly effective, run by a single corrupt lawyer in Baltimore who targeted vulnerable families and children deemed unmanageable by the system, taking large sums of money from the Ellisons for expedited placements. The lawyer was quickly arrested, his operation dismantled. The Ellisons, it turned out, had merely leveraged existing broken systems. The most difficult loose end was Daniel, Subject Alpha. Vance made the difficult decision to visit him at the asylum. He needed to understand the true depth of the Ellisons' psychological impact, both for his own peace of mind and for the official record. The asylum was a dreary, isolated place. Daniel was in a heavily secured cell, sitting quietly on a cot. He was still physically misshapen, but his eyes, when he finally looked up, were no longer vacant. They were filled with a profound, quiet sadness. Vance entered the cell, accompanied by a heavy-set guard. "Daniel," Vance said softly, "my name is Elias Vance. Do you remember me?" The creature spoke, his voice a low, raspy sound, unused for years. "The man who hurt my father. The man who hurt your father is now in prison, Daniel. He was a bad man. He hurt you too." Daniel shook his head slowly. "He gave me food. He gave me a name. He told me I was loyal. You were his prisoner, Daniel. He took your real life. Do you remember your real name?" Daniel closed his eyes, his face contorted in an effort to recall something that had been systematically erased. I think Benjamin. But that name makes my head hurt. Ellison said I had to forget Benjamin." Vance spent an hour talking to Daniel, slowly, carefully, peeling back the layers of his indoctrination. He realized that Daniel's loyalty was not love. It was a desperate, ingrained survival mechanism, a profound psychological addiction to his captors, the only figures who represented family in his broken world. The Ellisons had successfully installed a kind of behavioral bomb. But Vance also noticed something else. Daniel kept tracing a small, faded scar on his arm. "What is that, Daniel?" "A bird. My sister drew it on my arm. Before they took me, Ellison tried to burn it off, said it was a mark of disloyalty, but it never left. A small physical symbol of his true past that the Ellisons had failed to erase. Just like the children's memories of their families, the deepest human bonds proved harder to sterilize than the Ellisons believed." The visit gave Vance a final crucial piece of insight. The Ellisons' failure was in the fundamental, incorruptible nature of the human spirit. They could manipulate, but they could not wholly destroy. The final loose end concerned the town of New Harmony. The town was struggling to recover. The Macabre Preserve, the Ellison estate, stood empty, a black stain on the landscape. No one wanted to buy it, and its presence was a constant haunting reminder. Vance met with the town council. "You need to destroy it," he advised them. "The house is not just a building. It's a monument to the fear you all felt. As long as it stands, the preserve will be a reminder of the darkness. Tear it down. Plant something. Put the focus back on the future." The council agreed. A week later, Vance stood with Sergeant Miller on the edge of the woods, watching as demolition teams began the slow, loud, and satisfying process of tearing down the great ugly house. The sound of smashing wood and breaking glass was a final cathartic closure for the community. As the walls came down, Vance felt the weight finally lift. The house of horrors was gone. The criminals were caged. The survivors were healing together. He was ready to file his final report. "It's over, Miller," Vance said, placing his hat on his head. "The real work begins now. We need to focus on what to do with people like Benjamin. How do we help the ones who survived the Ellison's version of healing?" Miller looked at the rubble, then at Vance. "We start by making sure no one forgets what happened here. And we make damn sure that adoption agencies are held to a higher standard." "You've changed more than just a case, Elias. You've changed the way we look at people." Vance nodded. The darkness had been confronted, and in its place, a small, fragile light of necessary change was beginning to shine. The horror of the Macabre Ellison family would be a painful lesson, not a final conclusion. The demolition of the preserve was complete. In its place, the town council voted to establish a community garden and a small memorial park, symbolizing the town's commitment to growth, healing, and remembering the victims. Detective Vance formally concluded his investigation. The 150-page final report, detailing the crimes, the motive, and the survivors' accounts, was filed and circulated among law enforcement and child welfare agencies nationwide. The Ellison case served as a watershed moment in early 20th century child protection, leading to increased scrutiny of private adoption agencies and more rigorous psychological evaluations for prospective parents. Vance found a sense of peace in his work for the first time in months. The case had nearly broken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. He continued to correspond with Eleanor Hayes, receiving regular updates on the children. Clara and Thomas were placed together in a loving foster home in a neighboring state, their bond proving inseparable and vital to their recovery. Clara was learning to smile again, and Thomas, utilizing his quick wits that helped him survive the basement, was excelling in school. Silas and Eliza had a longer road. Silas, the teenager, struggled with deep-seated anxiety and trust issues, a direct result of the Ellisons' constant manipulation. Eliza, the youngest, required extensive physical therapy. But they, too, were in a specialized therapeutic facility, supported by the care fund established by the town of New Harmony. They found strength in knowing that others had endured and survived the same darkness. Daniel, Subject Alpha, now officially known as Benjamin, remained in the asylum. He was non-violent, but his loyalty programming proved difficult to undo. He would likely never be fully integrated into society, but he was being treated with dignity and respect, a testament to the community's refusal to see him as a monster, but rather as the Ellisons' ultimate victim. Vance received a letter from Eleanor, containing a small, hand-drawn picture, a crude but recognizable drawing of a garden, with 4 small, smiling figures holding hands. Below it, in Clara's neat handwriting, were the words, "We are all safe now." The Ellisons, meanwhile, were serving their life sentences. Dr. Ellison was attempting to write a new journal, claiming his incarceration was merely an inconvenience to his ongoing theoretical work. Serafina was reportedly withdrawn, her fury now internalized. They remained together in their isolation, their devotion to their twisted ideology unbroken, but their power was gone. They had failed to create their perfect child, and in doing so had created their own perfect permanent cage. Vance himself was changed. He was more guarded, more aware of the subtle, chilling capacity for evil in the most respectable corners of society. But he was also more compassionate, recognizing that true strength lies not in the authority of law, but in the resilience and empathy of the human spirit, the very qualities the Ellisons had sought to destroy. He was back in his small, quiet office in New Harmony. The metallic scent of the basement was long gone, replaced by the mundane smell of paper and tobacco. He was reviewing a new, ordinary case, a petty theft, a welcome return to normalcy. Sergeant Miller walked in, holding a newspaper. "Read this, Elias." The headline wasn't about the Ellisons. It was about the new laws being drafted in the state legislature, called the Clara and Thomas Act, mandating stricter oversight for child placement. "Your work has a legacy, Elias," Miller said quietly. "The horror is over, but the truth will keep them safe." Vance looked at the headline, then out the window at the distant, newly tilled earth where the Macabre Preserve once stood. He knew the story of the Ellison family would live on, a chilling cautionary tale, a scar on the history of the town. But its legacy wouldn't be the terror they inflicted, but the courage of the children who survived it and the systemic change that followed. The true ending to the horrible story was not the conviction, but the quiet, determined survival of the innocent. The horror was real, but the hope, Vance realized, was even stronger. He had faced the darkest corner of human nature and emerged not unscathed, but ultimately victorious, standing shoulder to shoulder with the 4 brave survivors who had refused to let their spirits be broken. The case was closed. The silence of the office was no longer an oppressive emptiness, but a peaceful calm earned through a long, dark battle.